Hey guys, in this video I thought we would take a nice little walkthrough of the basic pieces and parts and general configuration considerations that you might want to have under your belt before you tackle a kind of a little basic DIY system here with an inverter, battery, and solar charging. If you're not familiar with that, I thought maybe this might be some kind of introductory content that you would find helpful. Now I know this looks like a promo for Bouge RV. I swear it's not. They actually don't know that I'm doing this video. I did a review another time on this inverter. I already happened to have it on the wall. They did send me this fairly new charge controller that they came out with. This is the Sunflow 30 amp. I'll put links to this in the description below if you're interested. But this is not about the Bouge RV product specifically. I just happened to have it handy, and I thought, actually I have enough components from Bouge RV at this point that I could build a complete system, including solar panels outside, which we'll look at in a minute. I'm kind of talking about this bit right here, and this is a basic 12 volt 2000 watt setup, and I happen to be using two 100 amp hour batteries. Now these happen to be Bouge RV batteries, and these are self-heating, which is nice if you're not familiar with this kind of battery technology. Lithium iron phosphate, which is mostly what I talk about on this channel in terms of battery chemistry, definitely the way to go because they are the longest service life batteries out there. This particular one has self-heating and low temp protection, which is nice if you happen to be in an environment that is going to be subjected to multiple days of sub-zero or sub-freezing weather, we'll say. And these have the ability to kind of heat themselves so that they can keep being charged and discharged in extreme cold weather because they have self-heating built in. Now, if you see a battery that is just low temperature protection, it's not going to have a heating element built in. You could add a heating element on the outside if you wanted to, but low temp protection basically just means if the ambient temperature or the battery temperature specifically, sensors are reading below usually about 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 Celsius freezing temps, they will shut off the ability to charge the battery. It will give you a little bit more leeway for discharge, but not charging, because you might damage the cells if you do that, unless you have a self-heating mechanism built in. So you obviously pay more for low temp, a little bit more for low temp charging than batteries that don't, and you pay a little more on top of that for batteries that have self-heating capabilities. Now, these are both 12 volt, 100 amp hour batteries. You could do this system with a single battery. I've got these connected in parallel, which means I am adding up their current, which means the total capacity of this two battery system in parallel is 200 amp hours, but it is still a 12.8 volt system. So I'm basically doubling my capacity this way by connecting the negative to the negative and the positive to the positive. So 200 amp hour battery, but still a 12 volt system, which is necessary because this is a 12 volt inverter. And your battery's output voltage basically needs to be compatible with your AC inverter. Up here I have a charge controller. This allows me to get power from the charge from the solar panels and regulate the power from the solar panels, which fluctuates pretty wildly, and it regulates it in a way that is safe to charge the batteries. And this particular one, this Sunflow 30 amp from Bouge RV, does support 12 and 24 volt configurations. They make another version that I did a review on a year or so ago that also supports 12, 24, and 48 volt conversions or system configurations, and is also a 40 amp output. Now when you see 30 amp, that does not mean 30 amps in. That is the amperage that it can charge the batteries at, the rate of charge. So you need to make sure that the charge controller is an appropriate size or has an appropriate output or charge rate for the batteries that you're going to be charging. So this is actually quite a good matchup for a couple of 12 volt batteries to have a 30 amp charger. Now what's going on here? This is a bus bar configuration. And I've got it rated, these bus bars are rated for 250 amps, which is appropriate for this system because each one of these batteries can sustain 100 amp output. Now this 2000 watt inverter is not going to pull 200 amps for very long because that would be, it's going to trip the overload protection or overcurrent protection on the inverter if I do that. But the batteries are capable of it. And so I wanted to make sure that the bus bars could handle that kind of current. But what bus bars allow you to do is they allow you to land your cable connections on their own terminal. And so we have a shared negative and a shared positive bus bar. And that makes it much easier, and it also creates less resistance, because whenever you're stacking these ring terminal connectors, there is more resistance created and more heat, and you do get a little bit of voltage loss when you do that. This just makes it a little bit easier for cable management, and also reduces the resistance in the system when you're trying to stack multiple terminals on top of each other. So in fact, in the previous video that I did on a 12 volt DIY build like this, I stacked the charge controller and the battery terminals up here, up on the AC inverter. And a lot of people were kind of freaked out about that. You can definitely do that. It's not optimal. I just wanted to show you the quick and easy way of how it worked. This is a little bit more well thought out way. Now you also want to know, if I'm pulling a maximum of 2,000 watts and I divide that by a 12 volt nominal system, that's going to mean that at maximum capacity of 2,000 watts output, it's going to be pulling somewhere around 166 amps or something like that. So we need to make sure that we're using appropriate gauged cable for up to 166 amps. So that's why this is 2-aught cable. It's rated for up to 200 amps, and it's always better to overgauge than to undergauge. So the problem with undergauging is if I put 10 gauge cable up here that's rated for about 30 amps, and now suddenly I'm pulling 100 amps out of this thing, I've got problems, because it's not going to take very long for these cables to get overwhelmed by the current. They're going to heat up, the insulation is going to melt off, and I could cause a fire very quickly. So you want to be very careful of how you do that. Now, fusing is something that is confusing to a lot of people. Sorry, that was bad. And where the confusion happens is a lot of people think that the fusing is specific to the equipment that I'm connecting to. And it's really, the fusing should be matched to the cable that you're using. So you should always have a fuse from your battery array or your battery bank. And the fuse should be as close to the battery as possible. So don't put it on the other side of 10 foot of cabling. Put it right next to the battery. And I've got my fuse right down here. This is a 200 amp fuse, specifically because I want to make sure that, because these batteries can both produce 100 amps continuous, that's 200 amps total. I want to make sure I'm fused to not allow it to really go past that. I could get away with a 250 amp fuse here, which would be a little bit better, simply because when you're protecting your cables, a 2-aught cable is rated for 200 amps, and a 250 amp fuse would be an appropriate fuse level, so that I am giving myself a little bit of headroom. I'm not getting nuisance fuse blows or breaker trips, for example. Now you should also, when you're, and we'll take a look at solar panels in a minute, but you should also have a disconnect for your solar panels. And be aware that when you're using breakers, they need to be rated for DC in a system like this. These are all DC breakers or DC fuses. And DC breakers are different than AC breakers, because when you disconnect power, you pull together leads from a DC, you don't have the alternating current going back and forth, and therefore the arc that can produce when you're cutting the power can actually be harder to extinguish than it is in an alternating current system. So that is why you want to use DC rated breakers specifically for a DC system. So don't mix and match those. It's not appropriate. All right, but you definitely want to have a 2-pole disconnect. So you want to, for your solar panels, disconnecting both the positive and negative at the same time. Now, everything else can be fused off the positive lead only, really. There's no reason why you couldn't use a dual pole breakers there if you wanted to, but it's not really necessary. So I've got a battery disconnect here, always very good to have, so that you can emergency stop any power going to the rest of the system from the batteries if you need to, with just a single flip of the button. I've also got a little breaker disconnect here for my charge controller. And that is because if something goes haywire in the charge controller, I don't want it just dumping power from my solar array. I want to make sure that I have an appropriately sized breaker there. And again, appropriately sized based on the gauge of wire. Now this particular charge controller has a max of 10 gauge that it can handle in there, because it is only supposed to output 30 amps. So I have got a 40 amp charge breaker here, which is passable. I might actually would want to make it just a little bit lower than that in terms of amperage rating where it trips. But 40 amp is something I can get away with here. I used a little thicker gauge cable here. It's like I said, there's no problem using larger cable. The problem is when you're using smaller gauge cable. And remember, smaller gauge means bigger gauge number. So a 10 gauge cable is a much thinner cable, can handle less current than a 2 gauge cable. So do make sure you keep that straight. And I would highly recommend really making sure that you're totally comfortable with how these basic calculations and current and cable relationships are before you get into this, because you can hurt yourself. You can set up something that is a fire hazard or a shock hazard, and you definitely do not want to do that. So take your time and do your homework and make sure you've got it right. So what kinds of things can you do with a system like this? Well, you could use it to run a power for a small shed, anything up to 2,000 watts. And that's going to be, most power tools will run on 2,000 watts or less. You could use it for backup power for a refrigerator or freezer. Or just, you could run, actually I run a DC fridge in here almost nonstop. You could run an AC fridge with this system as well. And especially if you've got basically 2,500 watt hours of power, and as long as you've got some sun, you'll be able to keep that thing running pretty much indefinitely here. And certainly 2,000 watts is enough to run those kinds of devices. Now I do have a Google spreadsheet if you want to find out what other kinds of things you can run for how long. I'll put a link to that in the description below if you're interested in checking that out. I'd highly recommend downloading it and then tinkering with the cells once you get it on your computer. But it's very straightforward. You type in what the capacity is of your AC inverter. You type in what the watt hour, the rated watt hour capacity is of your battery system. In this case, you got 1,280 watt hours times 2, so whatever that comes out to, 2,560 watt hours. And you type that in, it'll list you what the run time is and the kinds of things it'll run, kinds of things it won't run. So you get a feel for that. If you find it helpful, go check that out in the link below. Now, a cool feature that I didn't mention before that is available on both this particular 2,000 watt AC inverter and also on this charge controller, there's a solar app that BougeRV has for these devices. And I'll put that up on screen here so you can take a quick look at it. But if I look at the one on the inverter, I can connect to the inverter first and it'll show me the current operating state, whether it's in eco mode. Eco mode basically shuts down the inverter and just does a basic, very, very small trickle current draw until it detects that a load is asking for power. And that allows you to keep from leaching power at a more aggressive rate if you just leave it on all the time. So the only downside of using the eco mode, by the way, is that sometimes when you add a load, it might take 10 or 15 seconds before it detects the load and flips itself on and then starts powering that load. So just be aware of that. But I think it's a good trade-off because it keeps you from just sort of leaching power unnecessarily if you're not actually pulling power out of the AC inverter. But I like that you can see all that. You can set some parameters right there in the app. Now, if I switch over, get out of that, and go look at the app for the charge controller, I'm able to see what the current battery voltage reading is, like I can see actually off of the AC inverter as well. But I can also see what my current charge rate is on this charge controller. And I can actually go into the parameters, that little gear icon in the upper right-hand corner, and I can set all of the battery parameters. And I would say it is much, much easier, by the way, if you get this charge controller to set that using the Bluetooth app, the mobile app, than it is to go here and mess around with the menu system, because the menu system is a little hard to figure out at first. It's really easy to kind of get lost. It kind of resets itself back to the first menu, and you have to keep paging down to find out where you were if you're setting multiple parameters. If you do it from the Bluetooth app and then just save it, it is so much easier and so much quicker and just less confusing, I will say that. So if you're going to get this, make sure you get the mobile app to do the configuration. Not required if you're worried about signing up and giving somebody your account information, having to sign into another mobile app. It's absolutely not required to use this particular charge controller. You can do it all from here, but it'll take you 5 or 10 minutes to kind of get the feel for how to make your edits and save them back to the device. So, but yeah, anyway, it's a nice charge controller. I like the fact that there's a Bluetooth app for both of these. Just makes it a lot more usable. So let's talk about solar panel sizing and how maybe over paneling might be a solution. What is that? How does that work? And what is the advantage? So let's go jump outside and take a look at that. All right, got a couple solar panel options here for this test. So over here on the right, this is the new 400 watt 10 bus bar solar panel from BougeRV. And it outputs somewhere in, I want to say around 37 volts or so, open circuit. And then I've got a series of 4 200 watt solar panels here. and these are also from Bouge-RV. And these put out about, I don't know, about 22 volts each voltage open circuit. And if we were to put these all in series, that would give me a volts open circuit number of somewhere very close to 100 volts. So probably just slightly under 100 volts. So we have to be very careful about that because we don't want to fry our charge controller. We need to be cognizant of our charge controller's limitations. But if I were to do a 2S2P configuration, which is in fact what I've done at the moment, you can see I've got a couple of these little parallel branch adapters here. Now these are also happen to be from Bouge-RV. You can see the label in there. But basically I've got 2 panels here strung in series, and then the other 2 panels strung in series. And then I have these parallel connectors stringing these 2 series strings into parallel back to my main charge controller. So basically what's going on is we've got these 2 22 volt panels strung in series, and then the other 2 strung in series. So that is 2 separate 44 volt series strings, and we're connecting them in parallel, which is still going to keep that voltage the same at around 44 volts. But if you notice the open circuit or short circuit current rating of around 12 amps up there, that will double because we'll have 12 amps for each series string. So we'll end up with about 44 volts and roughly about 24 amps. So keep in mind, if your charge controller doesn't support, let's say it caps out at 20 amps, well, you won't be able to quite maximize under ideal conditions. You won't be able to maximize the total output voltage. I wouldn't be able to get, for example, the 800 watts. Now, yeah, well, and we're going to talk more about that in a minute. So just be aware of that. Now, since that Bouge-RV 30 amp Sunblow charge controller actually has a limit of about 450 watts total when you're operating on a 12 volt system, which is how I've got it set up, and it will support a 24 volt system also, but I'm using it in 12 volt mode, and it does auto detect that, by the way. So what I'm limited here, I'll be able to connect this particular panel because it is well under the maximum 100 volts, and it should allow me to get the most out of this panel, which is a 400 watt panel. Now, even if I could string these 4 panels together in such a way that I'm staying underneath that voltage max, which I think is 95 volts approximately on that charge controller, I would still not be able to get the full 800 watts out of this 200 watt by 4 array. And that is because of the input current limitations of that charge controller. But the question is, on cloudy conditions, and this is what I want to see, on cloudy conditions, if I were to over panel that charge controller, in other words, put more than 450 watts of solar on it under the same cloudy kind of conditions, will I actually get, and how much more charging power will I get out of a 800 watt array by over paneling versus a 400 watt array? Let's go see how that works. All right, now real quick, let's just take a quick look here. I've got the 400 watt panel hooked up right now, and I'll pop up the app and you can see that I'm pulling just about 110 watts, 109 watts from that 400 watt panel. And that's because the angle's not great and there are a lot of clouds in the sky. Now we have over paneled also here that 800 watt array. So let me just hook that up real quick. And we'll see the difference that over paneling gets us. Even though I'm never going to get the full 800 watts out of that array. But take a look at the app now with the 800 watt array connected. Now, obviously you expect more power out of an 800 watt array, but the problem is that because this maxes out at 450 watts, with a 400 watt panel, even in the best of conditions, I'm probably not going to get more than 400 watts. You know, it would be very unusual even to get 400 watts. I might get 380 watts or 350 watts much more commonly in pretty good sun. But on a day like today, I'm only getting much lower than that, maybe a quarter of its rated output. But look how much output I'm getting out of the 800 watt panel, even though the sky conditions are not nearly as conducive. So I think that over paneling is actually a good option, especially from a cost standpoint, because it's much less expensive to add solar panels than it is to add battery capacity. And over paneling 20 to 25% beyond the watt rating of your charge controller actually will help you maximize your solar input in less than ideal sun conditions. So I think it's something to consider if you have the extra room in your budget. All right, like I said, this is not a sponsored video, but if you're interested in any of these particular products, Bouge RV is a nice one-stop shop kind of place to get this kind of stuff. So they do sell solar panels. You can buy them individually rather than having to buy them in large pallets, which is nice, especially if you're buying something in the 200 to 400 watt range. It's nice to only be able to buy a couple if that's what you need for a small backup power solution. And then they have a couple different types of batteries as well. They have multiple types of inverters. They have multiple types of charge controllers. So highly recommend you go check them out. I'll leave links to the ones that I'm showing you here in the video description below if you want to go check those out as well. But they are available, I think, mostly on Amazon and also on Bouge RV's website. And for some reason, I think they're a little bit cheaper on Amazon for the most part than they are direct on the website. But and I might have a discount code. I'm not sure if that discount code works. I'll try it out. If it does work, I'll leave it in the description below as well. But like I said, this isn't a video that Bouge RV asked me to make. I just had all the components and I thought it might be interesting to do a walkthrough with you in case this kind of stuff is something that you're interested in learning more about. Anyway, thanks for joining me. I hope you found some of this useful. If you did, please consider hitting that like button for me. Really appreciate that. And I do hope you'll consider joining me for the next one. Until then, have fun out there.